She was 19 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. The letter from her uncle had arrived on a Tuesday, 3 sentences long, informing her that the arrangement was no longer tenable now that his new wife required the upstairs rooms. In the pocket of her traveling coat she carried a brass surveyor's compass, its glass hairline cracked but its needle still true. The last thing her father had pressed into her hand before the scaffolding gave way in the summer of 1919. With $47 remaining from the settlement her uncle had called generous, she had bought, sight unseen, an abandoned hotel in a Nevada town she had located only by squinting at the fine print of a county tax notice. The deed was folded 3 times in her coat lining, and what nobody knew, not her uncle, not the county clerk, not the porter who had helped her lift her single trunk onto the westbound train, was that the notice had mentioned, in a footnote so small it might have been an accident, a sealed lower level, of uncertain condition. So settle in wherever you are watching from tonight. Tell us in the comments what town or country you're joining us from. Because the story of Clara Whitmore and the Aurora Hotel of Silver Hollow, Nevada, is one that begins with a locked door and ends somewhere very few people ever imagined a door could lead. Clara had been shaped by 2 people who could not have understood one another had they lived long enough to try. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, had been a structural carpenter who smelled always of pine resin and pipe tobacco, whose hands were roped with old splinters healed under the skin, and who spoke of a well-framed corner with the reverence other men reserved for scripture. He had taught her to read a schematic before she could read a novel, to sight a beam by eye, to trust a plumb line, and on the last morning of his life he had given her the brass compass and said, "A true north costs nothing to find, Clara, but it costs everything to ignore." Her mother, Eleanor, had died 4 years earlier of the influenza that took so many in that terrible winter. And Clara remembered her only as the faint scent of bergamot in a linen cupboard and the weight of a cool palm against a feverish forehead. After the funeral it had fallen to her father's elder brother, Silas Whitmore, to take her in, and Silas was a man who kept a ledger book on his desk the way other men kept a Bible. Silas ran a modest dry goods concern in Sacramento, and he had accepted Clara into his household the way one accepts a delivery that cannot be refused, with a receipt, a shelf assignment, and no further ceremony. He was not cruel. He was arithmetical. He fed her, he clothed her adequately, and he set her to work behind the counter counting nails into paper cones and reconciling the accounts by lamplight. And in this world she proved rapidly and quietly competent, because Clara had inherited from someone, perhaps both of them, a mind that did not misplace numbers. But at night, in the narrow room above the storeroom, she unfolded her father's old schematics on the floorboards and studied them by candle stub, tracing the elegant logic of a load-bearing wall while below her the ledger book of profit and loss slept in its locked drawer. For 6 years she lived between those 2 worlds, becoming, without anyone quite noticing, fluent in both. The dismissal came on a Wednesday in March of 1925, and it came for reasons so mundane they were almost polite. Silas had married a widow named Adelaide the previous autumn, and Adelaide had brought with her 2 grown sons who required, respectively, employment behind the counter and lodging in the upstairs rooms. Silas told her this standing behind his oak desk in the back office, one hand resting on the ledger and the other tucked into his waistcoat, his eyes fixed on the ink blotter rather than on her face. "The circumstances of the household have altered, Clara," he said. "I have arranged $47 for you, which is more than the law requires and, I believe, generous by any accounting. I have written to a Mrs. Pettyjohn in Reno who takes in boarders of good character. I trust you will find the arrangement satisfactory." She stood very straight and said, "Thank you, uncle. I understand." She did not sit, he had not offered her a chair. Upstairs she packed a single leather trunk that had been her mother's, 3 shirtwaists and 2 skirts, a woolen coat, her father's brass compass, a folio of his schematics tied with a shoemaker's cord, a tortoiseshell comb, and the small tin box in which she kept her mother's wedding band. On the mantel in the parlor there had once stood a framed photograph of her father in his carpenter's apron. Sometime in the autumn it had been quietly replaced with a portrait of Adelaide's 2 sons. And no one had ever explained where the photograph had gone. She closed the front door behind her without letting the latch click, and the brass compass in her coat pocket pressed against her ribs with the steady, patient weight of something that had already survived worse. The train south and east from Sacramento took 2 days and 1 night, and Clara rode in the second-class car with the compass in her lap and her trunk chained to the luggage rack. Dust rose off the alkali flats in slow reddish plumes and settled on her collar, on her eyelashes, on the sandwich the woman across the aisle had wrapped in wax paper and was slowly, methodically eating. The car smelled of coal smoke and sweat and the peppermint the conductor chewed to stay awake. Clara did not weep, because she had already conducted, silently, on the platform at Sacramento, the small private accounting her father had taught her. One cannot truly lose what one never possessed. And she had never possessed her uncle's affection, only his tolerance, so the ledger balanced. What she possessed was in her lap. She had found the notice pinned to the corkboard at the boarding house in Reno, a single handbill on cheap yellow paper advertising the tax auction of unclaimed properties in the abandoned mining district of Silver Hollow. And among the listings, in a footnote, the Aurora Hotel, 3 stories, 47 rooms, with associated substructures of uncertain condition, minimum bid $42.11. The name of the town sounded to her like a place where a river had once run and been forgotten, and that felt, in its way, like an invitation. Silver Hollow sat in a shallow bowl of bleached hills 70 miles from the nearest working railhead, and the stagecoach that carried Clara the last leg of the journey deposited her at 4 in the afternoon of the 21st of March, onto a plank sidewalk warped by 15 summers of neglect. The town was almost, but not quite, empty. Perhaps 40 souls remained, running a general store, a livery, a 2-cell jail, a Chinese laundry, and a single saloon whose piano had not been tuned since President Harding died. The silver had given out in 1911, the river had shifted its course northward in 1913, and what remained of Silver Hollow was a spine of false-fronted buildings baking in the sun. And rising above every other structure in the town, 4 stories of Italianate brick with a mansard roof and a corner turret and a wraparound veranda missing half its balusters, stood the Aurora Hotel, absurd, magnificent, utterly abandoned, the last extravagance of a boomtown that had believed too long in its own future. Clara stood in the road with the compass in her hand and looked up at it, and she felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was looking at a forgotten ledger entry. A building written off years ago and never crossed out, just as she had been. The county clerk was a gaunt man named Elias Beamer, who kept his office in the corner of the general store and who received Clara's inquiry with the careful, mild disbelief he reserved for door-to-door evangelists and Eastern journalists. "The Aurora," he said, tapping his pen against his blotter, "is what we call the Whitmore Folly, miss, no relation I presume. Built in '07 by a Mr. Angus Reeve who died in the panic of '08 and left it half furnished. Back taxes stand at $42.11 even. The building is, I feel bound to tell you, considered by the town to be a very expensive way to store dust." Clara counted out 4 $10 bills, 2 silver dollars, 1 dime, and a penny onto the blotter, and Mr. Beamer looked at the money the way a man looks at a joke he has decided not to laugh at. "Well, then, Miss Whitmore," he said, and reached for the wax and the seal. He sanded the ink of the deed with fine white sand from a shaker, folded it, dripped a coin-sized pool of red wax onto the fold, pressed the county seal into it, and slid it across the desk. "May the Aurora treat you kinder than she treated Mr. Reeve," he said. "And may the Lord treat you kinder than the Aurora." The front door of the Aurora Hotel was 8 feet tall and made of oak banded in blackened iron. And Clara pushed it open with her shoulder and stepped into a lobby the size of a small chapel. The ceiling arched 30 feet above her head, painted once with a mural of a sunrise over mountains that was now largely water-stained and peeling. Dust lay on the floor thick as a blanket of new snow, undisturbed except by the small tracks of mice. A grand staircase of walnut swept up into shadow, a reception desk of carved oak still bore on its counter a bronze bell green with age and a leather ledger book open to a page dated the 4th of November, 1911. She walked through it slowly, room by room, and she catalogued in her father's language what she saw. A soft roofline on the east wing meant water damage, but the joists were true. The plaster had failed in the ballroom, but the lath beneath was sound. The boilers in the cellar were rusted but of a heavy, honest cast-iron manufacture that could be scaled and re-riveted. The pipes were lead, which was a shame, but the runs were logical. She stood at last in the boiler room with her hand flat against the cold iron of the largest furnace, and she felt, beneath the neglect, the way one feels a pulse under a wrist, that the machine of this building was fundamentally sound. It was, she thought, not a ruin. It was a home waiting to be awakened. She chose, for her own quarters, a small servant's room off the kitchen on the ground floor, one window, one iron bedstead, one washstand, one door that closed and latched. In the first week she swept it, patched the window with a scrap of oilcloth against the night wind, cleaned the small pot-bellied stove, and hauled water in a copper bucket from the town pump 3 blocks distant, because the Aurora's own well, she quickly determined, would require a new pump housing before it could serve her. She rationed the water fiercely, 1 bucket for drinking and washing, 1 for cleaning. And not a cupful wasted, and she measured out her $47 of remaining funds in a small tin behind a loose brick in the chimney. On the 7th evening she lit the stove for the first time with kindling she had split herself from a broken banister, and she cooked a pot of beans and salt pork on its little iron top. And she sat on an overturned crate with the compass on the windowsill beside her and ate slowly, and the small orange circle of firelight in that vast dark building felt, she thought, like a small pocket of civilization in a country that had been given back to the wind. There was one door in the Aurora that would not open. It stood at the end of the ground floor corridor behind the kitchen, marked in faded gilt letters as proprietor, and its lock was a heavy Yale of a kind Clara knew well, because her father had once, on a wet afternoon in 1917, taught her the patient art of picking one with a bent hairpin and a strip of tin. She tried for 2 hours by candlelight, and she failed. The lock had been packed, she realized at last, with something more than tumblers. The mechanism had been deliberately jammed, possibly with a broken key, by someone who had wanted this door to stay closed. So she went to the boiler room and found a length of iron pipe and a claw hammer, and she went to work on the hinges instead. It took her the better part of 2 days. The hinge pins had rusted into their sleeves, and she had to work each one loose with penetrating oil scavenged from a can in the livery, with taps of the hammer and slow patient turns of a pair of pliers, until her knuckles were raw and her palms blistered under her father's old carpenter's gloves. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, the 3rd pin gave with a sudden crack, and she lowered the heavy oak door onto its face with a controlled thud, and she stepped, at last, into the office of Mr. Angus Reeve. The air inside was 16 years old. It smelled of leather, cold ash, dry paper, and the faintly medicinal ghost of pipe tobacco. A walnut desk faced the door, its blotter still bearing the imprint of a hand. On the desk stood an oil lamp with a full reservoir, a brass inkwell dried to a black crust, a pair of wire spectacles folded across a closed leather ledger, and a coffee cup with a brown ring of residue at its bottom. A wing chair faced the desk, and on the seat of the chair lay a folded gray cardigan, as though its owner had stepped out for a moment and forgotten his way back. The ledger was, in fact, a journal, and it was inscribed on its flyleaf in a firm, sloping hand, *Angus M. Reeve, proprietor, Aurora Hotel, Silver Hollow, Nevada, opened this 4th day of June, 1907. Clara sat down in his chair and turned the pages carefully, because the paper had grown brittle at its edges, and she read, in Reeve's clipped and courteous voice, the entire life and slow death of the Aurora. June 4, 1907. 41 guests on opening night. Champagne from San Francisco. Mrs. Reeve wore blue, October 12, 1908. Bank in Carson City has failed. 12 guests in the register tonight, room for 200, March 3, 1910. Ellen buried this morning beside Peter. The doctor says there was nothing to be done for either of them. August 19, 1911. Silver assay from the Comstock returned below cost. Foreman says the vein is gone. It is gone. November 4, 1911. Closed the doors today. I will remain in the office. The building deserves at least one witness, and then, in a smaller, steadier hand, one final entry dated more than a year later, January 8, 1913. The river has moved. I find I cannot leave, and I find I cannot stay. May whoever finds this be a better steward than I prove to be. Clara sat for a long time in that chair with the journal open on her knees, and then she rose and began, methodically, to inspect the room, because her father had taught her that a man who has decided something important almost always leaves a sign of it in the woodwork. She tapped the wainscoting board by board. She measured the depth of the bookcase against the outside wall and found it 3 inches shallower than it ought to have been. She pressed each pane of the window frame, she lifted each corner of the rug. And behind the desk, in the paneling of the wall, she found a place where the grain of the walnut ran horizontally where it ought to have run vertical. A strip perhaps 12 inches high and 18 inches wide. She tapped it, and it answered her hollow. She pressed its upper corner, and it clicked, and a small door swung outward on a concealed pivot. Inside the compartment lay 3 items. The first was a canvas bank sack, tied at the neck with a leather thong, and when she loosened it she counted, by lamplight, $782 in gold double eagles and small silver. The second was a woman's silver locket on a fine chain, its face engraved with the initials E. The third was a folded letter, sealed with a bead of red wax. Addressed in the same firm hand as the journal, to whomever finds this. She opened it that night in the kitchen, with the stove burning low and the compass beside her on the table. If you are reading this, Angus Reeve had written, you have done what I could not, which is to open a door I sealed against myself. My wife Ellen died in the spring of 1910, and our son Peter, who was 4, died 3 days before her, of the same fever. I built this hotel for them, and when they were gone I found I had built it also, unknowingly, for the town, which needed it, and for myself, which surprised me. I stayed on after the silver failed because I could not bear to abandon the last thing I had made with Ellen at my side. The money in this compartment was set aside from our best year, 1908, and I have not been able to bring myself to spend it. Because to spend it would be to admit that Ellen and Peter are gone and that I am simply a man alone in a building. I bequeath it, therefore, to whomever has the patience and the vision to find value in what everyone else has abandoned. Do not spend it foolishly. Do not hoard it, either. Build something with it. The locket was Ellen's. Keep it, or bury it with me, as you judge fit. Yours in trust, Angus M. Reeve. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the letter in one hand and, on the wood before her, the 2 small objects placed side by side. Her father's brass surveyor's compass and Ellen Reeve's silver locket. One, she thought, was a guide to true north, and the other was a reminder that true north was worth building toward. She would not, she decided, take the $782 and go. She would not board a train to San Francisco and open a milliner's shop or marry a stranger or vanish into a boarding-house life of quiet, comfortable regret. She would stay, and she would honor Mr. Reeve's gift by making the Aurora into what he had first meant it to be, which was a place that mattered to the people who passed through it. She folded the letter, placed the locket around her own neck under her shirtwaist, and closed her hand around the compass, and she went to bed for the first time in 6 years with a plan. Her plan was, on paper, quite simple. Silver Hollow lay on the last plausible overnight stop for the automobile traffic that had begun, that very year. To trickle down the newly graded county road connecting the Reno assay office to the fledgling copper interests near Ely, and the town's few remaining prospectors, ranchers, and drummers had nowhere to eat a hot meal that was not the saloon's charred beefsteak. The Aurora would become, therefore, 2 things at once: a lodging house of 12 refurbished rooms on the 2nd floor, run modestly and cleanly, and, on the ground floor, a public dining room and a small repair shop in what had once been the hotel's carriage house, where Clara would offer carpentry, mending, and light metalwork for travelers whose axles or trunks or spectacles had not survived the county road. She wrote the plan out on the back of Mr. Reeves' old letterhead, and she rode the freight wagon into the nearest supply depot at Fallon and returned 3 days later with 240 board feet of pine lumber, 6 panes of window glass wrapped in straw, a keg of 10-penny nails, 3 gallons of white lead paint, a coil of copper wire, a new pump housing of galvanized iron, and $11 less than she had left with. The men on the sidewalk who had watched her arrive in March with vague amusement watched her return in April with something closer to attention. She weatherproofed the east wing first, because the winter rains would come from the east and because her father had taught her that a building, like a person, must be sound where it faces the worst of the weather. She stripped the failed shingles from a 30-foot run of roof, laid new tar paper, and re-shingled it in cedar shakes she split herself in the yard, her arms aching for a week afterward in a way that felt, oddly, like a homecoming. She recaulked every window on the south facade with a mixture of linseed oil and whiting she cooked in a pot on the kitchen stove. She replaced the rotted sill of the front door with a piece of oak she had scavenged from a collapsed livery on the edge of town, planing it true by lamplight and setting it with wooden pegs rather than nails, the way her father had preferred. And on the 23rd of May, an old man in a dust-colored coat came up the front steps of the Aurora and stood watching her plane the door sill without speaking for a full 10 minutes before he said, "That's a Whitmore joint, if I've ever seen one." His name was Jasper Coles, and he had been, in his working years, a master finish carpenter on the great houses of Virginia City, and he had known her father slightly, in the way tradesmen of the same generation always know one another's reputations. He watched her work for another quarter of an hour, and then he said, "You've got the hands but not the wrist yet. Give me the plane." He took it from her, corrected the angle of her stroke with 2 words and a demonstration, and handed it back. From that day forward Jasper appeared at the Aurora 3 mornings a week without invitation and without payment. And by the end of June the ballroom's plaster was patched and skimmed to a finish Clara could not have achieved alone in a year. "I'm not helping you, mind," Jasper said once, when she tried to thank him. "I'm keeping my hand in. Buildings got to be respected." She understood that this was, in his idiom, a kindness of the highest order, and she did not press him further. The second person to appear was a woman named Winifred Ostler, who ran the town's remaining bakery from a 2-room adobe behind the general store. Mrs. Ostler was 62, widowed twice, and possessed of a manner so quiet it took Clara 3 weeks to realize that the covered basket appearing on the Aurora's back step every second morning was not left there by a stray but by Mrs. Ostler herself, who walked over in the pre-dawn dark and left, without knocking, a fresh loaf of sourdough, a small crock of butter, and, on Sundays, a piece of dried apple pie wrapped in a checked cloth. When Clara at last caught her at it and tried to press coin into her hand, Mrs. Ostler shook her head and said, "You're feeding the town, girl, whether you know it yet or not. I'm just feeding you until you catch up." And that, too, Clara understood was not a conventional friendship but something older and sturdier, a community assembling itself, one loaf at a time, out of shared work. The third was a man named Samuel Ong, who ran the blacksmith's forge that had once shod the mine's mules and now shod, in about equal measure, ranch horses and the occasional Model T that limped in with a bent tie rod. Samuel had come to Silver Hollow with his father from Canton in 1889, and he had the quietest eyes Clara had ever seen and hands that could read the temper of steel by color alone. He appeared at the Aurora on the 2nd of July, walked directly into the boiler room without asking, examined the largest furnace for 6 minutes in silence, and said, "Your father built the boiler house of the Pioneer Mill in Grass Valley in 1913. I saw it in 019. Same riveting pattern." Clara said, "Yes. He did." Samuel nodded once and said, "I'll help you re-rivet this. 2 hands are needed." You can't buck a rivet alone. They worked together for 4 weekends, and by the end of July the Aurora had hot water on all 3 floors for the first time since 1911. They spoke, over those weekends, perhaps 40 sentences in total, and it was one of the closest working understandings Clara ever formed with another human being. Months turned into a year, and then into a year and a half, and by the autumn of 1926 the Aurora Hotel was no longer the Whitmore Folly. Its brick had been repointed, its mansard reshingled, its veranda rebalustered, its windows reglazed. Its lobby mural cleaned and touched up by a traveling scene painter who had accepted 3 nights' lodging in trade. A new sign in gilt on black hung above the front door, the Aurora House, Lodging and Carriage Works, C. Whitmore, Proprietress. In the first month of formal operation the register recorded a copper geologist from Ely, a Ford dealer from Reno, 2 Mormon families moving south, a circuit judge. A stranded schoolteacher whose Model T needed a new water pump, which Clara built for her in an afternoon from a scavenged brass fitting. And a photographer from Sunset magazine who took a picture of the veranda at dusk and asked, in some bewilderment, how such a place had come to exist so far from anywhere. And the town, over that same 18 months, had settled into calling her Miss Clara, which was, in the idiom of Silver Hollow, an admission of citizenship. Her days settled into a shape she recognized as good. She rose at 5 and lit the kitchen stove, and by 6 Mrs. Osler's basket was on the step and Clara was baking off the second rise of the day's bread in the Aurora's own oven, from the sourdough starter Mrs. Osler had given her in a jelly jar the previous Christmas. At 7 Jasper came for coffee and to look over whatever repair Clara had planned for the day, and by 8 she was in the carriage house shop with her father's tools laid out on the bench, mending whatever the county road had broken the night before. At noon Samuel came for the noon meal, which was open to any traveler and any townsman who cared to sit at the long oak table in the dining room, and the conversations there had begun, without anyone quite planning it, to be the place where Silver Hollow discussed its business, the price of copper, the state of the road, whether the school ought to be reopened, whether the county might be persuaded to run a telegraph line. In the afternoons, if she had a free hour, Clara taught a boy named Micah, Mrs. Osler's great-nephew, how to sight a beam by eye and how to read a schematic, and she watched him grow, week by week, into the sort of competence her father had grown her into. And she understood at last what her father had meant on the morning of the scaffolding. On a quiet evening in the late autumn of 1927, Clara sat alone in what had once been Angus Reeves' office and was now her own. The walnut desk had been oiled and repolished, the wing chair reupholstered in dark green, the lamp trimmed and refilled. On the blotter in front of her, set carefully side by side, lay 2 small objects, her father's brass surveyor's compass, its cracked glass still faithful to true north, and Ellen Reeves' silver locket, the initials worn a little smoother by 3 years against Clara's throat. The compass, she thought, had been given to her to find her way, the locket had been given to her to remind her, on the days she found it, why one bothered to arrive. She thought, occasionally, of her Uncle Silas, and she thought of him without bitterness, because bitterness required a currency she had long since stopped carrying. Silas had done the arithmetic he knew how to do, and the arithmetic had produced $47 and a train ticket, and in the ledger book of profit and loss it had all balanced correctly. What Silas could not have imagined, what no worldview built on the ledger book of profit and loss could ever quite imagine, was that the elegant logic of a machine, when tended patiently by hands that had been taught to love it, could produce a life out of a ruin, a town out of a folly, and a home out of $47 and a locked door. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she had been 19 years old and, for all practical purposes, homeless. And she had spent $42.11 on a hotel that nobody wanted in a town that everybody had forgotten, and it was the best $42.11 she ever spent. Because it had bought her more than a home, it had bought her a life.